What's up, Sen Squad? Welcome back to another Brawl Stars video. Today we're going to be talking about Shelly and her attack, as well as Bull and Darryl, all the shotgunners in Brawl Stars, because their attacks are pretty similar but with slight differences, and honestly I feel like a lot of people don't know too much about the details of these shotgunners attacks in Brawl Stars, like how much damage will it do at a specific distance away, things like that. We're going to take a look at all of those features. So let's start off by looking at Shelly. So her max range is 7 2/3 tiles, and the shells of her attack spread out to a maximum of 3 2/3 tiles at the very end of her attack. Now, something to note about these shells is that they have a pretty weird hitbox. So they're grouped into sets of 4. Each set of 4 forms like a diamond shape, and you can see there are 5 separate groups of 4. Each one of those groups of 4 is what deals 1 tick of damage, and so in total there are 5 of these groups, so you can deal up to 5 ticks of damage with any one shot. And each of those groups of shells deals 420 damage if it makes contact with an opponent at max level, so in total that's 2100 damage if you manage to hit all 5 groups of these shells. But these shells also have a pretty weird hitbox. You can see in this video the shells are almost overlapping the very center of this robot's hitbox, yet they all pass through and none of them actually deal damage. Only the very center one dealt damage, but everything else, even though it looks like it's on top of the hitbox, doesn't actually deal damage. So the hitbox is a lot smaller for each of these groups of shells than the visuals might have you think. And also because they're sort of elevated off the ground, it makes the hitboxes seem even closer to the center of whatever target they're near. So this is something to keep in mind. The hitboxes are very thin. I'm pretty sure the hitbox only covers like the center 2 shells in any group of 4. So even just hitting one of those shells in any group isn't going to give you that damage. You got to make sure that the center part of that group is touching your opponent's hitbox in order to actually deal damage. So because of these small hitboxes, even at close range, if you try to manually aim your shot, a lot of times you're going to miss either 1 or 2 shells. You can see in this situation there is 1 shell that was missed, even though if you look at its path it looks like it went straight through the center of the robot's hitbox. So that's just something that happens with these shells. Because of the way they're visually displayed on the screen, it can be slightly misleading, so just keep that in mind. Manually aiming when close up is obviously a very bad idea. That's why we have auto aim. When it aims perfectly at the center, then it's harder to get this issue because you know that there's no human error involved. Now you might be wondering how much damage you're actually going to do depending on how far your opponent is away, because that's something very important to know if you want to get good with these shotgun brawlers. So Shelly is able to hit all 5 of those groups of shells and deal max damage if her target is anywhere from 0 to 2 tiles away from her, and she can deal 4 shots at most if they're 2 to 2.5 tiles away. If they're 2.5 to 4 tiles away, she can deal 3 shots at most, and if they're anywhere from 4 tiles to just the very end of her range, she's only going to be able to hit them with 2 of her shells. And I just found this by attacking, slowly moving backward, attacking again, and seeing what the maximum number of shells I could hit was. So that hopefully gives a good gauge of how close you need to be to someone if you want to deal out max damage. They have to be at most 2 tiles away from you, but that is assuming they're stationary. So when they're moving, these ranges get shorter because by the time the shells get 2 tiles away from you, your opponent will have moved slightly, and so they will no longer be in that perfect range to get hit by all 5. So in reality, all of these ranges that I said should be slightly smaller than they actually are, because you have to account for the fact that your opponent's going to be moving while your attack is in the air. But for most of the farther away ranges, the fact that your opponent is moving doesn't matter too much, because average movement speed of a brawler is 2.4 tiles per second, and actually the rate at which the shells are spreading out is also about 2.4 tiles per second at the very end, that 1st and 5th shell. So a brawler can basically get to the very edge of your attack and get on top of either that 1st or that 5th shell by the time your attack gets to them. So that's going to basically guarantee that only 2 or 3 shells are going to hit them. So what this means is that you do want to lead your shots with Shelly at a farther away range, because if they're in that 2 to 2.5 tile range where supposedly you can hit up to 4 shots, if they're moving at all, you won't actually be able to hit those 4 shots because they'll be able to keep up with the shells spreading out, meaning they'll be on the edge of your attack rather than inside it where you would be dealing that 4 ticks of damage. So if you try to lead your shots and predict where your opponents are going to go, then if they continue moving in that direction, your attack will hit just where you want it to, and they'll be in the center of your attack and will in fact deal that max damage that you're hoping for. But like I said, if they're less than 2 tiles away from you, auto aiming is the way to go, because manual aiming can a lot of times cause you to miss a few shells here and there. Now let's look at Bull, because Bull is actually quite similar to Shelly in terms of stats. So his range is shorter at only 5 1/3 tiles, but the maximum spread of these shells is actually exactly the same. So they also spread out to 3 2/3 tiles at the end of the range. The duration of his attack from the time these shells are released to the time they reach the end of the range is 0.63 seconds, so about 0.12 seconds shorter than Shelly's attack, which makes sense because it's a shorter range. And each of these shells do 560 damage instead of 420 damage, so a bit more damage for the sacrifice of a bit less range. But like I said, the spread stays exactly the same. And so the way we can calculate everything we want to know about Shelly, we can do the same for Bull. So since his range is 30% less, all the different cutoffs that determine what the maximum number of shells you can hit is just shrunken by 30. So instead of 0 to 2 tiles, shrink that by 30%. We now have 0 to 1.4 tiles is what your opponent's going to need to be within to have you be able to hit 5 shells max on them. And then to hit 4 shells, 1.4 to 1.75 tiles, 3 shells, 1.75 to 2.8 tiles, and you can hit 2 shells if they're at 2.8 tiles to the end of your range. But also for Bull's attack, the rate at which the shells spread out is a bit faster, simply because the range is shorter, but the spread stays the same. So now the spread rate of the shells is 2.9 tiles per second for those shells on the edge, and compare that to the average movement speed of 2.4 tiles per second. This means opponents aren't going to fully be able to keep up with the shells on the edges of your attack, so they're pretty much always going to stay within your attack even if you auto aim them. So Bull, even for people at a distance, it doesn't matter too much whether or not you auto aim, because whether or not they move isn't going to really affect how much damage you're doing. And then finally we come to Darryl, who is quite similar to Bull, except he has 2 waves of attacks. And that second wave is 0.25 seconds, so a quarter of a second after the first one. And he has a range slightly more than Bull's at 6 tiles, but once again, the max spread is exactly the same at 3 2/3 tiles. And the duration of one wave of shells is also exactly the same as Bull at 0.63 seconds. He obviously does less damage per shot, or he would be super broken, but he has 10 shells total instead of 5. So in total, he outputs more damage than both Bull and Shelly. And once again, we can just get ranges for how far away your opponent is, corresponding to how many shells you can hit on that opponent. And so if you want to hit 5 shells, they need to be within 1.6 tiles. If you want to hit 4 shells, they have to be within 1.6 to 2 tiles. 3 shells is 2 to 3.1 tiles, and 2 shells is 3.1 to the end of that 6 tile range for Darryl. Now with Darryl, when you're trying to account for other people's movement, since the duration and the maximum spread of the shells is the same for Bulls, then that means the rate at which the shells are spreading is going to be the same. And so once again, it doesn't really matter if your opponents are moving or not for a single wave of his shells. But the fact that he has a second wave that is delayed throws a bit of a wrench into things. So ideally what would happen is that if you aim in an ideal position to hit an opponent, you want to be in that same exact position relative to your opponent a quarter second later. So that way your second wave also goes in the exact same direction and hits them with the exact same amount of bullets. But in practice, that is never the case, since average reaction time for a human is already a quarter second. So by the time you react to your opponent's moving and try to move in the same direction, you'll have already shot your second wave of bullets. And by that point, if they have moved in a different direction, you're not going to be able to adjust your aim. So it's actually kind of good if you don't move when you attack with Darryl, because what you don't want to happen is for you to accidentally be moving in the opposite direction as your opponent, which means in that quarter second that it takes before you release your second wave, they'll have traveled on average an extra 1.2 tiles away from you. So if when you aimed the shot, it was aimed perfectly, by the time the second wave of shells comes out, they'll be 1.2 tiles away, and you're likely going to get virtually no damage. Probably only 1 or 2 shells at most are going to hit them if you're moving in opposite directions. So by staying in the same location, no matter which direction your opponent moves in, you can at least guarantee that they're only going to be 0.6 tiles away from you rather than 1.2, which at least guarantees like an extra shell. So you're probably going to be hitting them with 2 to 3 or maybe even 4 shells if you're lucky. Like I said, the ideal situation is that you just stay on top of them and you move in the exact same direction after you release your attack. But since you can't guarantee that's going to happen, basically just stopping and letting your opponent move in whatever direction they want reduces the variance as much as possible, while still making sure that on average you're getting a decent amount of damage with Darryl's attacks. But obviously, if there's a long range brawler or someone attacking you while this is happening, then you still want to be moving. In most cases, stopping isn't going to be practical in the context of an actual battle, because people are going to be attacking you, and when you're standing in one spot, it's easy to hit you. So you probably want to continue moving, so just try to move in the same direction that you think your opponent is going to move in. But worst comes to worst, if you move in opposite directions, you won't get much damage off of that second wave of attacks. But that's going to wrap it up. Hopefully you know a lot more about the small little details of the shotguns in Brawl Stars, how to get more damage with them, how close you have to be to hit specific amounts of damage on opponents, and how to dodge them. Hopefully this was helpful. Make sure to join the Send Squad by subscribing, turning on notifications, and going to your settings and enabling notifications there as well. But that's all for today, guys, so see you later.